Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Radicals Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. Last week, we started a series that will work its way through the War on Terror and how it's dragged on for almost 20 years at this point. We covered the attacks on 9/11 and the US verbal response to them, as well as diving into Osama bin Laden and his rise to power, as well as his creation of Al-Qaeda. We also went over a brief history of Western relations to the Middle East in order to uncover the tensions between the two halves of the world. This week, we will examine a couple of new individuals and look into the first 2 years or so of the war and how it quickly unfolded into a much larger conflict of ideologies and political power. We're going to start with the first counterattack of the US in October of 2001. The first stop after 9/11 is the almost immediate counterattack by the Bush administration on October 7th, 2001. On October 7th, 2001, a US-led coalition began attacks on Taliban-controlled Afghanistan with an intense bombing campaign by American and British forces. The logistical support was provided by ally nations such as France, Germany, Australia, and Canada. This attack would mark the opening of the US's War on Terror and was a direct response to the attacks on 9/11. It was named Operation Enduring Freedom and was intended to target Osama bin Laden, who we talked about last week, starting Al-Qaeda and planning his revenge on the West. Among other nations responding to the terrorist threat, some anti-Taliban Northern Alliance rebels also assisted US troops in the invasion, as they wished to see the oppressive extreme version of Islam that bin Laden had imposed on the entire country gone. During this rule, as many as 4 million Afghans are thought to have suffered from starvation or just died of other causes. The initial targets in the bombings were Taliban and Al-Qaeda installations in Kabul, Kandahar, Jalalabad, Kunduz, and Mazar-e-Sharif. Relief supplies were flown in as well, in an attempt to win over more of the Afghan population. This, in turn, prompted bin Laden to go on TV and declare a war against the whole non-Muslim world. After wearing the Taliban defenses down, the US moved to begin a ground invasion. This invasion force was primarily composed of the previously mentioned anti-Taliban rebels, with air support being provided by the US and other assisting nations. It only took about a month after the initial ground invasion for Taliban and Al-Qaeda forces to retreat from the capital city of Kabul, and by early December, the last Taliban stronghold in Kandahar had fallen. Now would be a good time to discuss another important Afghani individual and group, the founder of the Taliban, Mohammed Omar, and the Taliban as a whole. Without a firm birth date, circa 1950 to 1962, which is a really wide range, it is hard to tell at what age Mohammed Omar became radicalized in his religious beliefs, but in about 1994 he came to start the Taliban, a brief governmental organization but overall religio-political group dedicated to many of the same goals as Al-Qaeda. It acted as sort of another Pushtwali or fundamentalist Islamic group alongside of the Al-Qaeda group. The mid-1990s seemed to be a pretty tumultuous time in Afghan history, and it only took until 1996 before the Taliban took control of the city of Kabul and proceeded to rule Afghanistan with close ties to bin Laden and Al-Qaeda for the next 5 years or so until the US invasion. Now, back to the invasion of Afghanistan and the immediate impact it had in 2001. As I previously stated, it only took a few short months for the Taliban resistance to waver, and once the stronghold in Kandahar fell, Mohammed Omar was forced to retreat into the mountains rather than surrender. With both Al-Qaeda and Taliban forces in full retreat, and with the addition of US Special Forces to the ground invasion, a brief truce between the warring parties was agreed to, though it would later turn out to be nothing more than a ploy to allow for bin Laden and other officials to safely escape to Pakistan where they could continue their work. Thus, when the complex cavern tunnel system used by Al-Qaeda was captured, there was no sign of bin Laden. Moving into 2002, the US would launch Operation Anaconda, which was essentially an attempt to flush out the remaining Taliban and al-Qaeda forces in hiding in the mountains of Afghanistan. It began on March 2nd, 2002. By this time, US forces were well established in the Afghan region, and several operations had already been conducted. Clearly, the goal of these first 6 months of the war was to quickly and efficiently capture and kill as many members of terror groups as possible in such a manner as to keep similar groups from rising up in the future. Obviously, this didn't really happen. I found an interesting paper written by Captain George S. Midla, who was tasked with some of the logistics in the operation, where he outlines just a few of the medical issues the battalion ran into in the Afghan mountains. These included simple nutritional problems, as keeping soldiers adequately hydrated and fed is vital but difficult to accomplish. Altitude sickness, as the mountains are by no means small and many soldiers were not adequately prepared. Difficult medevac requests, and actually getting supplies and personnel out of the ranges at the conclusion of the operation. These were all huge problems for the military. It becomes easy to see how an invasion, meant to last only a few months, began to spiral out of control into an all-out war. All of these issues, combined with a rapidly dissolving plan of attack upon arrival, landed the troops in an awkward, difficult position. All things considered, the US had all the momentum coming into this campaign. Still riding the wave of the swift and decisive invasion of a few months prior, the US commanders crafted a complex battle plan. I risk getting into the weeds a bit here, but the plan was to use the hammer and anvil attack strategy. The strategy involves two attack groups, one to approach and provide pressure to the front, and the other to wrap around the back and force the enemy in between the hammer and the anvil, hence the name. Even upon first learning of this attack, I must say I'm a tad confused as to why this was the planned attack strategy. It is seemingly an attempt to use open battlefield tactics in what was essentially guerrilla warfare in the Afghan mountains. Granted, I have the gift of hindsight now, but I am hard-pressed to understand why the greatest military thinkers in the country would consider this an effective strategy. The whole battle was planned to take 3 days with light combat, and it quickly dissolved into an intense 7 days of fighting that would continue on to a lesser extent for another 10 days before being officially terminated. I'm not sure yet, but I'm getting the impression that the oversights and underestimations such are exemplified here would become commonplace and are the primary culprit for the not-so-speedy time frame this war has followed. At the end of the operation, a small amount of progress had been made at the expense of 8 American lives and 72 injuries, and the remaining al-Qaeda and Taliban were pushed out of the Shahikot Valley, leaving it in the hands of the US. So now we'll just kind of move to continue through 2002 and what was going on in Afghanistan. Things would continue like this for a few more months until a balance of skirmishes on the outskirts of Afghanistan became the norm, and by June of 2002, the country was seen as fit for the establishment of a new government. On June 13th of 2002, Hamid Karzai was democratically elected for a 2-year term as Afghanistan's transitional head of state, or president. His initial cabinet appointments attempted to ease ethnic divisions in the country and to weaken the power of warlords. And only 3 months into his term, an assassination attempt was made, costing the life of an 18-year-old shopkeeper. After this excitement, though, Karzai would go on to rule until 2014, when he was constitutionally barred from running again. All things considered, a president surviving that long and going peacefully into retirement is a rarity in Afghanistan, as historically presidential assassinations are extremely common. Overall, the first years of his rule seem to be viewed in a positive light, and the last few seem to have a more negative association, and I can't say I find that surprising. A country suffering under an oppressive religious rule that transitioned into a more democratic rule will lend happy citizens for at least a few years, but after ruling the length of time Karzai did, it is easy to see him falling from grace in more way than one. I'm sure we'll talk more about Karzai in upcoming episodes, but for now, this is enough information. With the new government established in Afghanistan, the U.S. could focus its efforts on Iraq, and this part of the war on terror would begin. On March 19, 2003, the U.S., along with some UK forces, initiated war on Iraq and would begin assault with a bombing run on Baghdad. President Bush said in an interview soon after, quote, "At this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq and to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger," end quote. Much of the case for this invasion was built on the premise of getting rid of Saddam Hussein. So we'll now take a brief moment to learn a bit more about Saddam Hussein. Born April 28, 1937, in Tikrit, Iraq, to a single mother and suffering the death of his older brother to cancer only a couple months later, Hussein was hardly seen as someone who would one day rule Iraq. After bouncing back and forth between abusive households for most of his young life, Hussein finally settled to live with Kajira Talfa, his uncle, and a devout Sunni Muslim whose nationalistic politics would have a profound effect on young Hussein. He would also attend the nationalistic Al-Karkh Secondary School in Baghdad, and in 1957, at the age of 20, Hussein joined the Ba'ath Party, who ultimately aimed to unite Arab states in the Middle East. When the Qasim government was overthrown in 1963 during the Ramadan Revolution, Saddam returned to Iraq and would be appointed the Deputy Secretary of Regional Command by 1996. In this position, he would continue to strengthen his political power, and after participating in a successful coup in 1968 and having a hand in many other political happenings in the government, Hussein developed Iraq's first chemical weapons program. The Iraq government would continue to suffer decades of turmoil, such as an invasion of Kazakhstan in Iran on grounds of oil, and ultimately an invasion of Kuwait in 1990. Finally, by 1994, Hussein was prime minister and effective dictator of Iraq and would serve as such until his capture in December of 2003. So, all in all, that will wrap up today. I apologize for our slow movement through the first few years of the war, but it's important to have all this background in order to make future assumptions about the state of the war. It should be obvious now, though, that for every step forward we made in our conquest across the Middle East, first in Afghanistan, then in Iraq, we found several more steps to take, and even in the first 18 months of fighting, we had already toppled 2 regimes and were working to establish new governments more friendly to Western wishes. We will find out more as we keep pushing through the years, but I would assume that this would be a common theme and one of the core reasons why this war has dragged on for so long. Next week, we will examine the fallout of the capture of Hussein and how that affected Iraq, and we will continue our push through the mid-2000s to keep unraveling all of these mysteries. But for now, that is all. Thank you all so much for listening to this episode of Radicals, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow, and I will talk to you all next time.